Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I thought I would talk about my favourite books of 2017. I'm not going to be mentioning any of the books that I reread this year in this video, but I have done a separate video on my favourite rereads of 2017, which I'll link down below as well. This will be quite a long video. I have a top 20 books of the year and one honourable mention, so I hope you, like me, have a cup of tea, and yes, I will try to go through them as quickly as I can. So before I get into my top 20, the one honourable mention I had is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. I read this, I think, fairly near the beginning of the year. It was my first Sarah Waters book, and it follows a young woman called Sue. She is from a very impoverished background in Victorian London, and she is sent by her family to sort of act as a spy, pretending to be a maid to a young woman that a friend of hers is trying to seduce. And everything kind of goes on from there. The reason why it is an honourable mention is because I didn't love everything about this. I gave it 4 stars, I enjoyed it a lot, but I thought there were way too many plot twists and that it got a bit insane at times. But it was also one of those books where I know I want to read a lot more by Sarah Waters because I really enjoyed the writing style, I loved the setting, I really loved all the themes, I just felt the plot was a bit crazy. But also, I felt that it was crazy in a way that sometimes Dickens is crazy, and so I kind of forgave it as well. So it's not a 5-star read for me. It wasn't the best book I read this year, but it was really, really enjoyable, and I know I want to read more by Sarah Waters in the future, so I thought I had better include it on this list as an honourable mention. On to my top 20. At number 20 we have Queen Eleanor and Fair Rosamond by Margaret Oliphant. If you can see, which you probably can't on your camera, that is not the title on this book, but this book is a Persephone Classics edition of 2 Margaret Oliphant novellas, one of which is The Mystery of Mrs Blencarrow, which is what it says on the front, and the other of which is Queen Eleanor and Fair Rosamond. I loved Queen Eleanor and Fair Rosamond so much. It was so different to what I was expecting. I'd heard that Margaret Oliphant was a bit trashy in the Victorian period and was considered so, and I was looking forward to reading her, but also thinking it wouldn't necessarily be the most interesting thematically or linguistically. I've read several other novels by her this year, all of which I enjoyed, but none of which I enjoyed as much as the novella Queen Eleanor and Fair Rosamond, which deals with a married couple and what happens when the man keeps on disappearing for quite a long time to London on business and not exactly coming back. It's a really, really interesting story with great themes, great writing, and one I would highly recommend. At number 19 we have this very little novel, A Start in Life by Anita Brookner. I was kindly sent this one as a review copy by Penguin when they produced a lot of new modern classics earlier on in the year. I'd never read anything by Anita Brookner before, didn't really know much about her, but thought it looked quite interesting, and it was. I really, really loved this. It's about a woman called Ruth who is a literature professor and takes us through a lot of her life, her relationships, her relationship with her parents who are quite childlike and often she takes care of them. I thought she was a really interesting character and I loved the relationship between her parents. Not because it's a nice one, but because it's really, really fascinating and they're such interesting figures. And I thought, although the ending was a little bit rushed, I loved the writing in this so much and I loved the storyline and the characterisation, and so I'm definitely looking forward to reading more by Anita Brookner in the future. At number 18 I do have 2 joint novels, but that is because they're both part of a series, and that is Imperium and Lustrum by Robert Harris. These are part of his Cicero series, which follow the life of Cicero, who was a real person in ancient Rome, but these are fictionalised, and they are, I suppose, sort of historical political thrillers. They're very dramatic, very exciting, absolutely gripping, a wonderful, wonderful series. I'm just about to start reading the 3rd one, Dictator, so hopefully I will finish that by the end of January. I listened to these on audiobook. The audiobook is brilliant and they're such interesting books. I'm getting much more interested in the history of ancient Rome, and I found these books so gripping and so exciting and interesting to read. So historically fascinating, but also so interesting in terms of the personality of Cicero and of various other historical figures who appear in it, such as Julius Caesar. Whether or not you think you're interested in Roman history, I would highly, highly recommend that trilogy. At number 17 I have The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jen Campbell. This is a proof copy which was sent to me by a review by Two Roads. The final book does not look precisely like this. It's the same illustration but different colouring, I suppose. If you don't know, Jen Campbell is a booktuber on YouTube and I'll link her channel down below. This is her debut short story collection, although she has had non-fiction and children's book published before, and I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed these stories. I was kind of expecting it to be magic realism, and it's not really magic realism. There are some sort of fantastical stories, but a lot of it is more to do with characters who are obsessed with magic or fairy tales in some way, rather than the stories themselves being sort of fairy retellings. I absolutely love the writing. It's beautifully, beautifully written, incredibly moving in some places, and there are some wonderful, wonderful ideas and stories in here, some more realist, some more fantastical, that I just absolutely loved. I really can't recommend it enough. It is a brilliant, brilliant short story collection and one you should definitely pick up. At number 16, I have Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. This is definitely my favourite Agatha Christie so far, and I loved it a lot. I think I partly loved it more for my sort of reading experience in that one day when I was off sick from work with a very, very bad cold, I read it all in one day, and there aren't many books that I can concentrate on when I'm not feeling very well, but somehow I managed to on Murder on the Orient Express. I think because it's written in such an easy way, so dialogue heavy and so thoroughly enjoyable and engaging. I read it because I wanted to see the film, which I didn't like nearly so much as the book, but I think the book is so clever and the solution to the mystery is so intelligent and smart and wonderful, and I thought it was such a brilliant, brilliant book. So interesting in its examination of morality as well. The title is pretty self-explanatory. There is a murder on the Orient Express. Poirot is there to investigate. I really, really do recommend it, and I'm looking forward to hopefully reading some more Agatha Christie this year. At number 15, I have the only non-fiction book on this list, and that is Elegant Etiquette in the 19th Century by Mallory James. This was sent to me for review by Pen and Sword Books just a couple of months ago, and I absolutely loved it. The title is pretty self-explanatory. It's about etiquette of the middle and upper classes in the 19th century, how it changed over time, how it varied from rural to urban areas, from sort of middle to upper class, and just how much etiquette was involved in so much of sort of social life. It's such an interesting book. I really, really loved it. I found it really, really fun and enjoyable to read, as well as being incredibly helpful for my historical fiction writing. So I would absolutely recommend this if you're interested in the 19th century. It's a good fun read, quite short, won't take you long, and yeah, thoroughly fascinating and thoroughly enjoyable. At number 14, I have When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro. This I really, really loved. It's about a detective in the 1930s looking back into his past when he grew up in Shanghai before the First World War. It's such a fascinating book, and it really got me back into Kazuo Ishiguro. I previously read The Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go and Nocturnes, all of which I loved, and then I read The Buried Giant, which I didn't really love, and kind of didn't read anything by Kazuo Ishiguro for quite a few years. So it was a real delight to read this and remember why I love him, and that maybe The Buried Giant is just like a blip that I didn't like, and the rest I do still really, really love. This reminded me a lot of Remains of the Day. I think overall I prefer Remains of the Day, but I almost think that When We Were Orphans is a better premise, but it's not quite as well executed as The Remains of the Day. I loved this a lot. I thought it was brilliant. I loved the setting of Shanghai as well as London, and I loved the main character of the detective. I thought he was such an interesting figure, but I felt that the ending let it down just a little bit, or they didn't quite meet everything that it should have done. At the same time, I still really, really loved it and would absolutely recommend it. I haven't heard as many people talk about it as Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go, so it is one I would definitely recommend picking up if you've read those two and love them. At number 13, I have Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. This has really been a year of Elizabeth Gaskell for me, partly in rereads and partly in new reads, and Sylvia's Lovers was an absolute marvel and really, really enjoyable. The reason why it's not further up this list, even though I loved it a lot, is because I didn't love the first half as much as the second half, and yet it still belongs a fair way up this list because it was so brilliant. It follows a character called Sylvia, although we never really get to see that much inside Sylvia's head, and I don't think we fully understand her, but she's torn between two men, one who is her friend, who is sensible but she doesn't really feel that attracted to, and another who is a more exciting sailor who she doesn't know as well but who she feels a kind of passion for, and the book carries on from there. I loved it a lot. It can be a bit hard to get into, partly because a lot of the dialogue is written in dialect, but at the same time it is a beautiful, wonderful, engaging story, and especially the second half I loved. It's so unpredictable and different and fascinating, and Philip is such an interesting character, even though I don't like him at times. I think for me, the book is more about him, one of Sylvia's lovers, than it is about Sylvia, and I think he is such a fascinating character. All in all, I would highly recommend Sylvia's Lovers, and just like everything by Gaskell as well. At number 12, I have The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. This is a beautiful historical novel that I read very recently and really, really enjoyed. I'm definitely looking forward to reading more by Tracy Chevalier in the future. This is set in the Netherlands in the 17th century and follows a young woman when she goes as a maid to a house where an artist lives in order to clean the house, but also ends up helping the painter in some way. And the premise of the book is that it is a story behind this painting, which is a real painting even though the story is not real. It's a really, really enjoyable book. I thought that it was done perfectly and that the book was subtle enough where it needed to be subtle, but also wasn't like over the top or too explicit where it didn't need to be. I thought it was so correctly placed, so on point, and really, really enjoyable. I loved Tracy Chevalier's writing so much, so yes, Definitely a highlight of the year, and I'm looking forward to reading more by her. At number 11 we have another short story collection, and this is In the Country by Mia Alvar. I was recommended to read this by Weena from Weena Wonders, and I'll link her channel down below. And she spoke about how much she loved this book, and my boyfriend Nick also read it on her recommendation and really liked it, so I thought I would pick it up, and I absolutely adored it. It follows characters who are from the Philippines, some who are still in the Philippines or some who have left and gone abroad to different places. The stories are all quite different, but they all deal with sort of senses of space, both going away, coming home, and they all blend beautifully the political with the personal, which I know is something Weena said she really loves about it, and certainly something I really enjoyed. How these stories are all sort of personal and intimate and about individual characters, but they're also bound up in the history of the Philippines. I thought it was such an interesting and fascinating short story collection, and I really can't recommend it enough. Absolutely brilliant, so worth a read. One of the most interesting books I've read, and great to learn about places that I don't really know very much about. At number 10 I have The Singer's Gun by Emily St. John Mandel. Emily St. John Mandel is one of my absolute favourite authors. I find it really weird that I read this year. It feels like I read this really quite some time ago. I think I must have read it back in January or February. But regardless, I really enjoyed this. It's about a man called Anton who grew up in a fairly criminal environment. His parents sold stolen antiques, and him and his cousin were kind of involved in crime, but he worked to get out of this, and he now lives a fairly ordinary corporate life. But his past is beginning to catch up on him, and everything is starting to change. I love this so much. One of the things I love about Emily St. John Mandel is the way she uses structure and time, and another thing I love about her is the precision of her writing. It's not flowery or poetic, but it's beautiful, and I love it, and I love this very much. She's one of those authors that can really make me cry at moments that should not make me cry. And talking about authors who are very good at making me cry, at number 9 I have Reservoir 13 by John McGregor. I don't think this book is perfect, and yet I love it so dearly. It follows 13 years in the life of a town after the disappearance of a teenage girl. But it's not about the disappearance of the teenage girl. It's not even particularly about the effect of the disappearance on the town. It's more just about 13 years in the lives of this village, this rural village in England. Everything that changes, everyone who gets married, who gets divorced, who has children, who dies, and just everything that happens. It's very zoomed out. I don't think it will be for everyone, but personally I loved it. I love the overview, I love the setting, I love the small moments that really moved me. Even though I never felt I really knew anyone completely, you do get a sense of them in the way you might get a sense of people if you lived in the same place as them. I think it is a beautiful, interesting, fascinating novel. I love John McGregor very much. He's one of my favourite modern authors, and yes, this is one I would certainly recommend. At number 8 I have The Last Chronicle of Barset by Anthony Trollope. This is the last book in the Chronicles of Barsetshire, and I do have 2 other books from the Chronicles of Barsetshire to talk about in my favourite books of 2017 later on, because I loved this series this year so much. I adore Anthony Trollope very much, and I've really enjoyed reading this series of books. They are 6 interconnected novels, I suppose you'd say, in that they all take place in the same county, and there are a lot of characters that crop up in each other's books, but they all have sort of separate stories to a certain extent. The Last Chronicle of Barset links many of the previous stories and characters together and is absolutely wonderful. One of the things I love about it is how it follows a particular man, a clergyman who has been accused of theft, and the effect of his accusation on his mental health as well as his physical health and the lives of his family. I think it is such a beautiful book. Really compelling, really gripping. There are parts when I was on the edge of my seat, not knowing what Anthony Trollope would choose to do and how he would choose to end particular character storylines, and yet I loved it so much. I think he is such a skilled writer, so funny, so interesting. His characters are so psychologically complex, and yes, I would definitely recommend that series very much. At number 7 I have Manhattan Beach by Jennifer Egan. This is my favourite contemporary novel of the year. The next 6 are classics and short story collections, but this was one that I really loved. I really like Jennifer Egan. I've read Emerald City and A Visit from the Green Squad by her before, and I'm really looking forward to reading more by her in the future. Emerald City is my favourite short story collection ever, and I really was excited to read more by her, and Little Brown kindly sent me this proof copy for review. The actual book does not look quite like this. This follows a woman called Anna in World War II America. She volunteers to be a diver to repair ships. She's the first woman to do so. No one believes that a woman could do so, and she kind of proves them wrong, and it's kind of awesome. There is a lot more to this book than that, but I think that's one of the most interesting parts of this book. The rest of the book has so many fascinating themes, however, to do with family, to do with love, to do with relationships, to do with war and the way it affects people, and to do with sort of New York gangsters in the 1930s and 40s. As I think I said in my individual review, which I'll link down below, I don't think many authors could write about gangsters in a way that is so entirely uncliche. This is great. I would absolutely recommend it. Jennifer Egan is a wonderful, wonderful author. At number 6, another Barchester novel, and that is Framley Parsonage by Anthony Trollope. This is the 4th book in the Barchester Chronicles and one that I really, really loved. There are two sort of plot lines going through this. One is about a young man who is the vicar of Framley. He lives with his wife, he has a few children, but he is a little bit reckless because he kind of wants to be a member of society and he kind of wants to be thought of as a lot more fun than clergymen often are, which leads him to get sort of into trouble with the wrong crowd. And then it's also partly about his sister and her relationships with the local lord. It is a brilliant book, so original and unconventional, which is one of the things I love so much about Anthony Trollope books. It's very, very, very rare in a Victorian novel to have your main hero be a man who's already married. And that I thought was just really nice, and I quite liked seeing Mark's relationship with his wife, especially when his wife doesn't always approve of his behaviour, and he loves her very much and he loves his family, but also he kind of wants to have fun and he kind of really, really wants to be liked by people in society, and that sometimes overrides other important duties in his life. Such a brilliant book. I can't recommend that series enough, as I already said, and this was certainly one of my favourites. At number 5, I have The Odd Women by George Gissing. This I read in Victorian October and really, really loved. I think it's possibly my favourite George Gissing novel so far, and it is a very, very feminist Victorian novel, which is something that makes me very happy. The title, The Odd Women, comes from the fact that in the second half of the 19th century there were, I think, 500,000 more women in England than men, and so even if every woman and every man wanted to get married, there literally wouldn't be enough men to go around all of the women. And so it is about women looking to other options in life than marriage, which was often considered sort of the aim in life for a Victorian woman. Two of our main characters run a typing school where they teach other women how to type so that they can go on to become clerks and have careers and do interesting, worthwhile things with their lives. Basically, it is a book which explores the fact that marriage doesn't have to be the be-all and end-all, and I love it very, very much. It's so interesting, so historically fascinating, so encouraging and lovely in places, but also so gripping and dark and upsetting in other places. I think the Rhoda Nunn plotline is better than the Monica plotline, but despite that, I adore this very, very much, and I highly, highly recommend it. Number 4, I have another short story collection, and that is Last Fling by Sue G. I don't have a physical copy to show you because I had borrowed it from my mum and I gave it back to her, but I absolutely adored this. I haven't read any Sue G since I was about 16, and she was one of the few contemporary modern authors that I actually read as a teenager, because I mostly read Victorian literature. But Sue G is an author I absolutely adore, who I think has such a beautiful way with words, and I love this short story collection so much. And there were stories that I read and finished and then went back and reread. I can't remember the last time I did that with a short story collection, where I read several of the stories twice just while reading it because I loved them so much. There are a lot of like personal reasons why I connected with particular stories. A lot of the characters in the book are elderly. It's such a wonderful and beautiful story about growing older, but also about what remains important and what continues to be important. Really, really beautiful. Such brilliant stories, and one of those short story collections that has really, really stayed with me. At number 3, I have A Dark Night's Work by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a Gaskell novella that I read for the first time this year, and I can't believe I've never heard anyone speak about it before because I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It's about a young woman called Eleanor. Her life is going okay. She lives with her father, who is widowed, and she falls in love with this young man. Everything seems to be going well, and then one day something goes wrong and everything changes. It's exciting, it's dramatic, it's beautifully written, it's really, really engaging, really, really enjoyable, and nice and short. So I definitely, definitely recommend A Dark Night's Work. It's so, so good. I love Elizabeth Gaskell a lot, and this is one that I would absolutely recommend. I have done a full review on this back in my Gaskell week, so I will link that down below as well. And then at number 2, my second favourite book of the year is another short story collection, and one that I read way back in January 2017, and that is Smoked Meat by Rowena McDonald. This, I think, is probably fair to say my second favourite short story collection of all time after Emerald City by Jennifer Egan, and this is absolutely brilliant. It is a series of interconnected short stories, which I love, all set in Montreal, and it follows various characters who often crop up in other stories, many of whom are artists, many of whom work in bars and cafes. There's a lot of kind of similar themes and situations running through the book, and it is absolutely beautiful. I love Rowena McDonald's writing so much, and I just thought this was one of the best, most interesting short story collections I've ever read. It is a collection of realist short stories, and I think the way Rowena McDonald digs into characters' psychology and their emotions is so brilliant. This book is so, so good. You have to please go and read it. It's wonderful, so engaging, so enjoyable, such a brilliant, brilliant collection of short stories. Like I said, one of my absolute favourite short story collections of all time. But at number one, my favourite book of 2017 has to be The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope. I love Anthony Trollope a lot, and this year has been a year with quite a lot of Anthony Trollope in, which was lovely, and this book I loved it so much, and I was so staggered by how much I loved it that I want to talk about it forever. In many ways it reminded me in setup of Sense and Sensibility. We start off with two sisters who live in a small house, the small house at Allington, which is attached to the big house at Allington where their uncle lives, who is the squire, and they are slightly reliant on him for sort of money and for their home, but they are not due to inherit. And there is Lily and there is Belle, and Belle is calm and sensible, a bit like Eleanor in Sense and Sensibility, and Lily is a bit more passionate, a bit like Marianne. And yet this book is so much better than Sense and Sensibility. Not to diss Austen, but Sense and Sensibility is my least favourite Jane Austen novel. And what I loved about this book is that in many ways it has a similar setup, but then everything goes awesomely. And in the way that I think, like, really Sense and Sensibility would go. There is so much in this book that I adore. I think the character of Lily Dale is amazing. And then the character of John Eames, who is a clerk in London, who is kind of a young man who's not quite a man yet and is still kind of a little bit of a teenage boy, or a hobbledehoy, as Anthony Trollope calls him, and his character arc and his personality is so thoroughly, strongly developed and so interesting and so engaging and brilliant, and he's just one of my absolute favourite literary characters. I love the way the different plots intersect in this. I love the way we move between Barchester and London. I love the fact that in this book there are so many moments where the characters could be so happy if only they made slightly different decisions. There is a lot, like I said, that I love about this book, but I think my favourite thing is the ending, because I think it is, to a certain extent, a brave ending for a Victorian novel, and I think it is the perfectly right ending for this book, and I love it so much. I love this book so much, and it's a real joy, because I read a lot of great Victorian literature when I was a teenager. I don't think in sort of the last 5 years I've discovered any Victorian books that are new that like belong in my top favourite 10 books of all time, if you see what I mean. But this book is just incredible. I need to reread The Way We Live Now to work out which one of them is my favourite Anthony Trollope novel, but I was so blown away by this book. You must read the Barchester Chronicles. You probably need to read the other 4 before you read this. The other 4 are very good as well, but even if they weren't, it would be worth reading them just to get to this incredible masterpiece of a book that I adored, like, so thoroughly intently. Yeah, this is a good one. Definitely my favourite book of the year. I read this back in June. I read half of it on a plane. I like sobbed on that plane with no shame, because this book was so incredible and moving and amazing and perfect. So yes, that was that one. So those are my favourite books of 2017. I hope this hasn't been too long, and I hope it hasn't been too animated. I feel like I slightly shouted at the camera while talking about The Small House at Allington, but there we go, it's a very, very good book. Please let me know down in the comments if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them, and also what your favourite book of 2017 was. And I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.